In his book, Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, the late James Hornfisher describes the Battle of Samar and Sacrifice of Taffy III as one of the greatest last stands in naval history. A true David versus Goliath. 80 years later, we remember the sacrifices of the nearly 2,000 American casualties from that fateful October 25th day. In this video, we're going to look at just one of the brave ships that awoke that morning to the pagoda mass of the Japanese fleet on the horizon. USS SAMUEL B Roberts, DE-413, was one of 563 destroyer escorts built during the Second World War. Smaller than a fleet destroyer of the era, she still packed a punch. Now, this is not a video that will focus on the battle itself. If you wish to learn more about that, I highly recommend picking up a Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors copy. In this video, we're going to look at some of the damage sustained by the SAMMY B and show the approximate locations on the Slater. As one of only 2 destroyer escorts in the United States, the Slater offers us a unique resource to tell the story of not only the SAMUEL B Roberts, but all destroyer escorts. And despite serving on opposite sides of the planet that day, the Slater and SAMUEL B Roberts crew may have known each other to some degree. Only weeks before they were commissioned, members of the future crews completed training in Norfolk, Virginia. At the end of their time there, the Slater crew were awarded the flagship colors trophy of the crew competition in the Baker Division, just beating out the SAMMY B crew. Slater sonarman Bob Lice recalled the time he and the other Slater sonarmen traveled from San Diego following their training to the East Coast for advanced training aboard USS SILF PY-12, a yacht which was converted to a sonar training vessel. 5 others were sent from the Key West Sonar School and joined them. Bob Lice and his group were then pre-assigned to USS Formo DE-509 and the Key West guys to another ship. Both groups then traveled north to Norfolk following their training aboard the SILF, but arrived late and missed their ships and were reassigned. Bob and his fellow crew were told they would travel to Florida and join the Slater. The Key West guys were ordered to Texas and the SAMMY B. Both destroyer escorts were commissioned only days apart and about 800 miles. SAMUEL B Roberts on April 28, 1944 in Houston, Texas, and Slater on May 1, 1944 in Tampa, Florida. By late May, both were in Bermuda for their shakedown cruises. Over the next few weeks, both destroyer escorts conducted all forms of exercises preparations for their future deployment. Both were attached to Task Group 23.1, commander of which was on the destroyer tender USS Hamel AD-20. SAMMY B was attached to Squadron Dog, while Slater in Squadron Easy. 2 members of Squadron Easy went on to be present at the Battle of Samar. USS Abercrombie DE-343 and USS Walter C. Wann DE-412 were assigned to Taffy II that day, only a few miles south of Taffy III. Around the time SAMMY B sank, the screening force of Taffy II were in the early stages of also preparing a torpedo attack on the Japanese force, as shells splashed close by. However, the enemy forces shortly thereafter retreated after sustaining heavy damage from the aircraft from Taffy II and III, and the destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy III. According to the action report, it's believed 20 or so direct hits struck her, varying in size from 5-inch, 8-inch, and even some 14-inch. The first hits were a salvo taken by OA-51, and it's believed these were 8-inch armor-piercing rounds, which did not explode thanks to the lack of armor on destroyer escorts. A hole was opened in the No. 1 lower handling room, a steam line was ruptured in the No. 1 fire room, and the IC gyro room was abandoned as it began to flood. It's important to remember the Slater has a slightly different compartment arrangement than the SAMMY B. As a cannon-class destroyer escort, the Slater was armed with 3-inch 50 caliber deck guns, compared to the 5-inch 38 caliber on the SAMMY B. The 5-inch guns utilized handling rooms for the 5-inch projectiles and powder. They would have been placed in a hoist and set up a few decks to the gun. On the Slater, there is no hoist. A couple hundred rounds were stored on the main deck adjacent to the guns. And if more ammunition was needed, the crew would have had to pass rounds up through the decks manually, by hand. With the compartment damaged in the first salvo, the SAMMY B crew was forced to remove the projectiles and seal the watertight doors and find a new route of sending the rounds up to the main deck. As you can see, this is not the handling room at all on Slater. Today, it is used for storage of old mattresses and pillows. But during Slater's service, this was the small arms magazine, and we could have expected to find ammunition for pistols, rifles, submachine guns, shotguns, even some grenades. The adjacent compartment was originally ordnance stores, spare parts for all the ship's weaponry. This cozy compartment is again used for storage. Galley pots and pans, along with sets of china and mess trays, call it home in 2024. It was in these compartments that the SAMMY B was first damaged. That first salvo also pierced a steam pipe in the number 1 fire room. A major perk of all these small destroyer escorts is their speed and maneuverability. Not only was the number 1 fire room damaged, but it was also knocked out of action and the compartment filled with high-pressure steam. This shell pierced the main deck just a few feet aft from the hatch to the fire room, leaving roughly a 4-foot in diameter hole. As a result, maximum speed was reduced from over 25 knots to around 17 knots. Now remember, the destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 were in a melee with faster and more powerful Japanese ships. Losing any amount of speed only compounds the dire situation that Taffy 3 found themselves in. The setup of Slater's number 1 engine room is much different than SAMMY B's number 1 fire room. Cannon-class destroyer escorts like Slater are slower than their steam counterparts thanks to a diesel-electric propulsion system. And this engine room aboard Slater has not been restored at all since the ship returned from Greece in 1993. Very few steam lines exist on the ship, as it would have only been needed for heating, cooking, cleaning, etc. But try to imagine yourself in this compartment as a battle rages outside. At any moment, a shell could puncture the deck above or the hull on either side, sending a deluge of cold water into the ship. The same is true for the handling room. Only minutes after the first hits, more and more shells began landing around and striking SAMMY B. The number 1 engine room, on Slater that would be the number 1 motor room, was also hit and knocked out. Outside was just as bad as inside. The aft twin 40mm and its corresponding Mark 51 director were taken out by a direct hit from either an 8-inch or a 14-inch shell. Lieutenant Commander Copeland later wrote that no trace of this gun or mount could be found once the smoke cleared. The damage from the shell extended to other parts of the deckhouse and the interior of the ship. Further hits from 14-inch shells tore a hole 30 to 40 feet in length on the port side, right around the after cruise compartments. The number 2 engine room was obliterated and the fuel tanks ignited. Fires quickly spread throughout the after part of the ship and onto the fantail. With both engine rooms and 1 fire room knocked out, the SAMMY B came to a stop, dead in the water. Fire mains were destroyed, and the ability for repair parties to extinguish fires was no longer an option. More hits continued to pepper the little ship, and she became a tangled mess of steel after the smokestack. It was at this time that the ship fired her final rounds. In the number 2 5-inch on the stern, the gun crew got down to their last few rounds. Their gun had been damaged, resulting in there being no way to eject the explosive gases that collect after each round is fired. After firing 6 rounds without the gases being cleared, a 7th round cooked off inside the breech, killing nearly everyone inside the mount. And it was here that the mortally wounded Paul Henry Carr, gunner's mate 3rd class, was located, clutching one final projectile, attempting to get one more round off. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, and in 1985 USS Carr, FFG 52 was commissioned in his honor. After sustaining dozens of hits and near misses, the surviving crew abandoned ship by 09:35. 30 minutes later, she rolled 80 degrees to starboard and then sank slowly by the stern. Her wreck was lost to time until the summer of 2022, when a team led by Victor Vescovo located her over 4 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. In the description below, you can find a link to the Caledon Oceanics video of the wreck. The Samuel B. Roberts holds a special place in our hearts here at the museum, largely thanks to the previously mentioned last stand of the tin can sailors. Our tour guides often make it a point to tell the story of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, and the sacrifices of all the other ships in Taffy 3. It's with that in mind that I hope you take some time today just to briefly reflect on the bravery of these ships and the sailors who manned them. For without them, the outcome of the war as we know it may have been much different.